Hello and welcome to the 9th episode of The Prop House. In this episode, we're going to be making Thor's hammer. So, let's get started.
So to start off, I took 2 big foam cubes. Now these cubes are for like fake flower arrangements. They're not the ones that you soak in water. They're hard. And I glued them together with E6000. E6000 is like this crafting glue that's really strong. I believe it's actually kind of called liquid cement. It's like one of their advertising blurbs. So I put that in between the 2 cubes. And then I put something heavy on it to overnight to glue it up nicely. So after it had time to cure overnight, I took out a clear ruler and I started just kind of guesstimating lines on all the edges. And those were supposed to be basically guidelines for my knife as I created beveled edges for all of the edges, because this hammer does have beveled edges on all of its edges. I didn't end up using the guidelines a ton. Like, they were useful at first, but then as you get kind of past it, you start to get in a groove and then you start kind of working it out yourself. Now, something to remember is as you're carving, don't get too worried if you take off a little too much in a certain area, because later on when we mud this foam to make a hard surface for it, you can add more mud later and then sand it down and then add more mud and basically fill in the areas that you carved away too much. So you basically can cover up all your crimes with mud. So next, I had to create the hole that my dowel rod goes into. Now the dowel rod will be the handle of the hammer, so I stuck that right on the top, right in the middle of the hammer, and I traced around it with a Sharpie. And then I used my Swiss Army knife and I started to carve off away from the outline and slowly work my way to the outline. That way, trying not to take too much off. I did end up taking a little too much off in the end, but learn from my mistakes. Take off less than you need and stop before you think that you put less than you need, if that makes any sense. So take off less than you think you need. I also use some needle nose pliers to reach down into the hole and rip out foam, because you want to put a decent amount of the dowel rod into the foam, so that way it's sturdy enough that if you're gonna use this as a costume piece or something, it's not just gonna snap out of the foam. You want it kind of in there. Now after some more carving, it was time to mud. Now I do want to preference, try to know when to stop carving. I had some areas that I carved too much away and I should have stopped. It's a tough thing to know, but you got to try to figure it out at some point, I guess. But this is all-purpose mud I'm using. So this is the kind of mud they use to fill a hole in your wall or fix where drywall has been ripped. It's something that you can find at about any hardware store. So I just use a putty knife in the mud, and something to keep in mind that I didn't know at first, but I learned as I was going along, smush the mud into the foam. You want to fill all the holes. If you're just doing it over the layer, you're going to end up getting holes peeking through. And something to keep in mind is mud naturally shrinks as it dries. Mud will crack and it will open up, if that makes any sense. So you're going to have to do multiple layers of this. It's something that's going to take a couple of days, it's going to take time, and it's going to be kind of frustrating because you just want to work on it, but you have to let it dry. But you're going to have to let it dry. It's just part of the process. But make sure not to fill in the hole you just cut for your dowel rod. Try to go around it. I had some foam break off, so I had to fill up kind of where the dowel rod was around it. But do not fill into it. It's just gonna be a headache, and you're gonna have to clear it out again. Yada yada yada. You can just wonder. So now it's time to start sanding. Woo! Except it's not. So here is a major mess up / thing I learned in this project. Temperature matters. Obviously, you think I would have known that. I've done quite a few things with mud, but I had my hammer in my garage. I would leave it overnight. But even though where we live it's normally warm, it's been cold recently. And we've had quite a bit of rain, which ended up leading to it not drying. So I suggest you put this on some sort of tray or something, and you bring it inside your house where it's a bit warmer and let it dry overnight inside, because if you're like me and you leave it in your garage, you could end up causing it to not dry. And that's a big reason why this project was pushed to next week, is it would not dry in time, so I had to start bringing it inside the house and able to get it to dry in order to be able to sand it. So now that it's actually dry, let's talk about gear. As you can see in this shot, at times I am wearing something to cover my nose and my mouth, and gloves, and an apron. The apron is just to keep my clothes from getting cuts or whatever, because I like having an apron on to protect my clothes. But the gloves are to protect my hands. I have really dry hands and they constantly crack, and getting a bunch of drywall mud dust in your cuts is not fun. And then the mask is to help with breathing, because as you sand, drywall mud is very dusty. Everything around you will become covered in dust. And you should wear something to cover your mouth and nose, because breathing this stuff in is just not fun for anyone, especially the person who breathes it in. Now, another little tip is the type of sandpaper you use. Now, your initial response is probably just to go buy any sandpaper, but if I can give you a little tip that I was taught, screen paper is the way to go when it comes to drywall mud. It is it's airy, it has holes, and it's like a screen door almost, but it's rough, and it allows the dust to go through it, and it causes less friction while shaving off the mud more like a cheese grater. So it shaves it off and causes less friction, so it gets less warm. If you've ever used sandpaper on mud, you know that the sandpaper heats up extremely quickly, and this allows you to be able to sand longer without burning yourself, not really burning yourself, but causing all that warmth, which can be very annoying, and it's overall just a way better tool to handle drywall mud. Now from here it gets a little repetitive. It is mudding, sanding, mudding, sanding, mudding, sanding, so on and so forth until infinity. This is where you're going to lose your patience with this project. It gets very repetitive here, but it's important to take your time and try to make your mud smooth and try to make your sanding smooth, if that makes any sense. The smoother you can make it look with the less kind of divots and dimples throughout the hammer, the better it's going to look. I was going for more of a cartoony Thor hammer, but if you were trying to go with something more like the movies, this is something extremely important to try to get smooth. I'm sure there are better ways of making a smooth Thor hammer than this, but I really like this method because it's something that anyone can really do. This is not exactly expensive stuff. A lot of it's stuff you can get at Walmart, and it's a good project. It was a lot of fun making. Something else I'd like to point out is where I'm doing these corners, I am not doing it the right way. It wasn't until the very end that I learned the better way to do this would be to actually get mud with your finger and rub it into the foam at the corners. It's going to come out a lot smoother, and you're gonna get the mud in the foam instead of just getting it to lay on top of it. I didn't know this at the time, I know now, and now I'm relaying it to you guys. So now that you spent 2 lifetimes sanding and mudding, I have actually cut out a lot of footage because it gets boring. It's time to start painting, yay! So I actually used a gray primer spray can, and I really liked the gray that came out of it. I think it was a great color in the end. Also, I'd like to point out, I'm not very good with spray paint. I'm trying to learn how to get good coats with it, but it's very much an uphill battle for me. I always put on way too much and it kind of comes out blotchy. So learn from me, don't make it blotchy. Now how do you not make it blotchy? I don't know, still trying to figure that out. So yeah. So So now it was time to start working on the handle as the head of the hammer dried. So I started by sticking the dowel rod into the hammer before painting it and marking how far it went into the hammer, and then I figured out how big I wanted it and marked it there too. Then I just cut it at the second mark. And then from there, I used a staple gun and I stapled my fake leather ribbon at an angle and started wrapping it very tightly all the way down the hammer, and then I stapled it at the bottom, and then I trimmed the excess off the top and the bottom. So then I cut a small square and I stapled it to the bottom of the hammer, as well with a small piece of fake leather ribbon that I cut to make a strap for the hammer handle. And then I cut a strip not as thin as the wristband part, but thinner, and then I wrapped it around the very bottom to kind of make a cap. And I did my best to tuck the square that I cut for the bottom of it into the wrap to make it one cohesive end cap for the bottom of the handle. And after the paint had dried, I noticed some areas that needed to be patched, so I used that finger technique to rub in the mud, and then after it dried, I sanded it and then painted over it again.
So now it's time to put the handle in. I ended up just friction fitting it in. I was gonna use glue, but once I got it in to see if it fit well, it was so stuck in there, I was afraid if I pulled it out, it would end up tearing more foam and making it worse. And it's in there really well for me, but glue might be something that is necessary for you. And now it's time for glamour shots. Well, I'm super happy with how this hammer came out. It's super big and cartoony, which really I'm glad I went with the cartoon one more than the more movie kind of realistic grounded one. I mean, it's not super grounded, but you know what I mean. The cartoony hammer, it looks great and it's gonna look really good on a shelf. I'd like to make a kind of a V-stand to sit the hammer in at an angle. I think that would look really cool, but maybe that would be maybe a mini episode or something. I think this is a great project to do if you're wanting a project to do, other than the days of waiting for it to just dry. It's not hard at all. It's just, sanding and mudding, some gluing, and then some wrapping of leather and stuff. You have to cut wood once, but you could totally do it with a handsaw. I think this is a great project to do. It's not too hard and it doesn't cost a ton. And you get a really cool piece at the end of it. Well, that's all I have for today. Thanks for watching.